You know, if you're going to make a video talking about a Resident Evil remake in the year 2023, you're probably not going to be talking about the remake of Resident Evil 3 from 2020. I am, though, mainly because Resident Evil 4 remake came out this year, and before it came out, I decided I was going to replay through the other remakes. RE Remake is one of my favorite games ever, and I like Remake 2. So when it came time for me to play 3 Make, I wasn't super excited because I remember feeling very disappointed with the video game. I didn't think it was particularly fun. But it had been a couple of years since I touched it, and I thought might as well. When I think about Resident Evil games, I think a good marker of quality of that Resident Evil game, at least to me, is how replayable it is. And I really like the original Resident Evil 3, but I always have such a hard time replaying it, mainly because I hate that clock tower fight. That clock tower fight is so annoying that whenever I think about playing an old school Resident Evil game, I think, do I want to deal with the Nemesis clock tower fight? And 9 out of 10 times I go, nah, I don't want to deal with it. And so I usually don't replay RE3. For an RE3 remake, they could just make RE3 again, but make that clock tower fight not as annoying, and that would be the perfect video game. I made a small couple of reviews of the OG Resident Evil trilogy, and I argue in those videos that the Resident Evil games were always going in a more action direction as early as Resident Evil 2 and 3. RE3 being even more actiony makes sense, so it's fitting that the Resident Evil 3 remake is the even more action version of the Resident Evil 2 remake. I went into my replay of 3 Make expecting it to be bad, but it is way better than I remember it. And I think that comes from expectations and, mentality. The game feels like playing an action horror movie. Playing this game with the perspective and expectation that you're basically playing a horror movie that will turn into an action movie, I think makes it much more enjoyable. 3 Make is a very streamlined experience. The game is so short and fun to play, for me anyway, is that when I went back to record an extra playthrough for this video, I did it all in a 2.5 hour session. The characters are fun for the most part. They have a good amount of personality. I think they have more personality than most military goons get in movies and video games. Tyrell, Carlos, Nikolai, Mikhail, and Jill all get a reasonable amount of screen time, and all are kind of cool in their own way. The set pieces are cool. I don't mind the cut areas or puzzles too much because the game ramps up the action and the tension pretty well, so I don't necessarily miss them. I'm not complaining that I don't get to hang out in the zoo or whatever. I'm happy that we get to go through the areas we get to go through in a pretty straightforward manner. Basically, there's a handful of areas in Resident Evil 3 that all have a couple of different puzzles that you can backtrack to get a few extra secrets. And then once you're done one section, it's off to the next section and the next section. I don't mind it too much. I think it's different enough from RE2, and it's also relatively enjoyable, especially when you're not trying to take it as a backtracking, puzzle-solving video game, instead treating it as sort of a tense third-person shooter that evolves from being horror-focused to being action-focused. I also like that the encounters feel like puzzles. Like Nemesis, he's the big idea of the game. He's this big monster. He follows you throughout Resident Evil 3, constantly going like stars. And he's a huge force to be reckoned with. He hits you once and he kind of just combos you to death. He's very scary and very bulky. But what I mean by the encounters being like puzzles, if you just use one hand grenade on Nemesis, he goes down. Every time. So being smart enough to use the very limited number of hand grenades in the game to deal with Nemesis kind of feels like solving a bit of a puzzle. Or you have the Hunter Gammas, and they are very easily countered by fire grenades. Granted, if you don't have fire grenades, they're pretty difficult to deal with, but I like that there are just plenty of answers to a lot of different enemy types, so that having this big arsenal is also like having a bunch of solutions to future problems. You know, them bringing the dodge mechanic from OG RE3 back was a very bold choice of them. I think a lot of video games, you know, including third-person shooters, have dodge mechanics. None are so weird as the original RE3s. This game technically has an easier to understand, or at least easier to perform, dodge. It's mapped to a specific button, but the timing is very weird. I personally think it never truly feels good or consistent to use, but I do appreciate that they tried adding it. It makes Jill feel different to play as than Leon or Claire. I also think that Remake has a good reuse of enemies, much like how Majora's Mask reuses a bunch of Ocarina of Time assets, and how the original RE3 uses a bunch of RE2 assets. Remake is the exact same way. I like the reuse of the white zombies and even the lickers, and I also think that the enemies in general are pretty good in this game. You know, it's much more action focused. You can have a couple different types of enemies like the Drain Demos and Hunters and Hunter Gammas. And I think a game that is more action focused, only having the same handful of enemies that a game like RE2 Remake having, wouldn't be as fun. So I'm glad that they kind of ramp up the encounters alongside locations. Overall, Remake has a pretty quick pace. Because it only takes 3 to 4 hours to beat on a first playthrough, it isn't actually that long until Jill is equipped with decent weapons, turning RE3 into a pretty fun third-person shooter instead of a horror game. That's a pretty normal thing for Resident Evil games, right? To go from being a horror-focused experience to then sort of getting you equipped with a bunch of weapons and it becoming an action experience. RE3's pace being so quick and fast does kind of mean that you're pretty geared out by the time you leave the train. Maybe like an hour into the game, you probably have a shotgun, and a pretty good pistol, and maybe a couple grenades. Now, I understand that there's a lot of things that are different about this game. Personally, though, I do believe the biggest sin this game makes is it takes what I think is the coolest line ever said in a video game, and they basically take it out. Jill not saying, "You want stars? I'll give you stars," at the end of the game is so heartbreaking. Instead, she says it here.
Come on, you creepy ass stalker. You want stars? I'll give you stars.
Now, what's super fun about this is that she can get hit out of saying the line, my favorite line in all video games.
You want stars?
And you could go your whole playthrough and never hear her say it, which on my first playthrough, I thought they cut it from the game. No, they just threw it here, which is sad. I have no defense for this. Ignoring the stars line perspective, I would also say that the game took away the most unique aspect of Resident Evil 3. And no, I don't mean Nemesis. I mean, a Nemesis-type character is in so many video games, including so many Resident Evil games. I mean the different scenarios. And that probably is the biggest problem with this game as a whole. If you don't remember or don't know, in the original Resident Evil 3, you had these options to do different scenarios. You know, it would give you like pick one or two options. And sometimes it would lead you to different bosses, or it would give you like different outcomes that would make fights different and certain scenarios different. It wasn't groundbreaking, it wasn't the most dramatic thing in the world, but what it did do was it made replaying the game more fun. For a lot of things, replaying Resident Evil games usually is more fun because the game gets harder and you get some rewards. You get like rewards like costumes or a new gameplay mode. But Resident Evil 3 made it so that you could play the game differently and have different encounters, having a different experience, and I think that's really cool. The remake being as short as it is, and then also having no real reason to replay it, is probably its biggest issue. I will say, though, that playing the remake on harder difficulties is fun. They do change the layout of where and when enemies spawn, which can be pretty cool and a little exciting. Granted, they don't change on every difficulty. I think it's after hardcore is when they start changing where enemies spawn. I will say, the last boss on nightmare difficulty is incredibly difficult. I think I spent like over an hour and a half just bashing my head against the wall. This nemesis fight is so hard, and I'm using an infinite ammo rocket launcher, and he is still destroying me. He's just so fast, man. He's brutal. I just don't feel like there is a real reason to replay Resident Evil 3 Remake unless you just like replaying it. Surprisingly, you get no costumes and no real rewards for replaying it. And you can't even experience new content for replaying it because there's no different scenarios. I said you don't get any rewards, but really you don't get any useful rewards. So by completing in-game tasks and challenges and even beating it on certain difficulties, they give you these in-game points, which you can use to spend on in-game rewards, like an infinite ammo pistol or this really cool fire knife called the Hot Dogger. However, let's say you wanted to get all of the rewards, the infinite ammo rocket launcher is the most expensive. It is so expensive that basically getting any reward that isn't the infinite ammo rocket launcher puts you extremely far behind because those points you collect are finite. And so really, if you want the infinite ammo rocket launcher, you don't really get a fair opportunity to use any of the other weapons, which are pretty fun to use. Overall, Resident Evil 3 Remake was a good time. It's surprisingly short, even if you collect all of the items in a single playthrough. It isn't an overwhelming game. You're always moving from location to location, and there's a constant flow of challenges, set pieces, and boss fights. I wish there was more to this game, but I do think it uses the resources that it has to a surprisingly great effect. It's not a groundbreaking game, but one that I enjoy playing significantly more than other entries in the series, including the original RE3. I get a very specific experience out of RE3 Remake that I don't really get from the other Resident Evil games. I really like its pacing, and I think its mechanics are serviceable enough that I don't mind them. I think it's a good time, a good focus on combat, and level design. I enjoy it. I think it's fun. I think it's underrated. I get that people were mad when this game first came out and it cost $60. I think that's super fair. And people mad that it isn't as glowing or as amazing as Resident Evil 2 Remake. I also think that's super fair. But I think what I would encourage you to do is, if you have even a vague amount of interest in this game, to give it a shot and to go through with the mentality that you're playing a movie and kind of treat it like that, and maybe go through with a little bit of a different mentality instead of trying to compare it to other entries in the series, including the thing it's remaking, and just take it on its own terms as a dumb, fun game that goes from being slightly horror focused to being extremely action focused. Maybe you'll end up enjoying it as much as I did.